This is the Everyday Fray podcast, hosted by Michael Howie.
Hello, friends. This is Michael Howie, and I'm thrilled to be welcoming you to the very first episode of the Everyday Fray, a podcast for people with mental health issues and those who love them. A lot of you first-time listeners will be coming over from my other podcast, Defender Radio, which focuses on wildlife, the environment, and other animal-related subjects. While I intend to run the Everyday Fray in much the same curiosity-driven interview style, the subject will be much different and much more personal. Mental health is something I'm connected to. I was diagnosed with Generalized Anxiety Disorder, with a healthy smidge of social anxiety, when I was about 18. Mental health and addiction issues also run throughout my family, and I'll touch more on that in a moment. Now, there are already some wonderful podcasts out there about mental health, many of which focus on specific issues or have unique styles. I'm not an expert in mental health. I have absolutely no training in the field, and this show isn't meant to cure or heal anyone or replace the guidance of a physician, treatment, or a therapeutic environment. This is an opportunity for me to be somewhat selfish. I want to look into issues related to mental health that I find interesting, in the hopes that maybe I'll learn a little bit, discover new tools, and have an enjoyable cathartic experience. I can only hope that it will be beneficial to you too, as I explore this vast subject through interviews. My plan is to have a new episode every week, published to everydayfray.libsyn.com and pushed out to multiple platforms from there. I've already created social media channels, Everyday Fray Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you want a more direct connection to me, you can always email me at everydayfraypodcast@gmail.com. I look forward to getting feedback, hearing your stories, and exploring new ideas for interviews with you. This show will be interview-based, but before I start airing those interviews, I want to share my story that will maybe give you insight into why this project is so important to me. My childhood was remarkably normal. Like, you could ask Stephen King to try and find something with which to give it a dark twist, and he'd come up completely dry. I was born and raised in the suburbs of Toronto, in a bedroom community. My parents are still together, and neither me or my older sister experienced any kind of trauma. My family was well off, living in an affluent community with good schools, access to every resource we could need, and we never wanted for anything. But as far back as I can remember, I was more afraid than other people. My memories from around the age of 6, which is about as far back as I can reliably remember, are about things that scared me or nightmares. Now, this is said with perfect hindsight, of course. At the time, I just had a lot of nightmares, and didn't like changes, and got an upset stomach. A lot. I wasn't a super healthy kid. I wasn't outdoorsy or into sports. I had asthma, as well as a somewhat significant environmental and seasonal set of allergies. I couldn't stay at the overnight for my summer camp because I kept getting nosebleeds. We had to get rid of our Christmas tree because it triggered an asthma attack. I did play baseball until I was about 10, but I never hit the ball, not even during t-ball, and I couldn't really throw that well. I was something of your stereotypical, pasty, chubby, few friends, good with computers nerd throughout my childhood. Fortunately, in the ensuing 30 years, I did get a bit of a tan. The regular upset stomachs led to ultrasounds, blood tests, and visits to the doctor's office at regular intervals. I don't know if the medical professionals of the day weren't really considering mental health issues like generalized anxiety disorder for kids, or if my doctor, who I always liked and did right by me, simply didn't know. But it wasn't until many years later that a mental health diagnosis was sought. Through my preteen to teen years, that remarkable lack of remarkableness continued. I got rebellious at 16 as I began to explore who I was and how I felt about the world around me. I got into punk rock music and shows, tried learning guitar, and began craving the attention that came with being a gregarious, purple-haired teen. At the shows, and even in the liner notes of a local band's debut album, I was called Crazy Mike Howie, a title bestowed for antics within and outside of mosh pits that I held proudly and a little too firmly. That fit in well with my father's traditional conservative outlook, which predictably led to conflict, but even that was stereotypical and without significant incident. There was a lot going on for me at that time, and frankly, I'm a little hazy still on some of those details. But it was in that 16 to 18-year-old range that things started going off the rails. My average grades slipped into the arena of failing. My social life was erratic, wanting to go out and let loose with complete abandon, and simultaneously wanting to watch Star Trek and eat chicken wings by myself. I'd find it impossible to fall asleep, and then after 9 hours of slumber, find it impossible to wake up. There were times I really felt crazy. I was trying so hard to fit in and be this certain type of person, combating how I really felt much of the time, and teaching myself the horrible lesson that not caring and failing was easier than trying to succeed. And that lesson hit just about every aspect of my life. Around the time I was 17, the coping strategies I had inadvertently developed, such as rocking out hard at punk shows and caring too much about not caring, began breaking down. I distinctly remember one day sitting on the grass with 2 friends waiting for a bus to go get a tattoo, and suddenly feeling sick. It was hard to define sick at the time. I was hungry but nauseated. I was sweaty but cold. And I was really, really uncomfortable. I bailed and went home, where I quickly felt better. This kind of situation began repeating itself with growing regularity, including the night of my then-girlfriend's semi-formal. At the event, I began developing those same symptoms. I went to the bathroom and dry heaved. I had to use the toilet, but couldn't. I felt like I was being chased by something that wasn't there, which was equal parts terrifying from the physical manifestation and the realization that I felt like I was being chased by something that wasn't there. I went home and again felt better by the time I fell asleep. It was within a few weeks, though, that 3 things happened. My grandfather died, I was told my high school didn't expect to see me back in September, and my family was supposed to be going west to an out-of-town wedding. I never knew my grandfather well, something I do regret to this day, and I didn't know how to respond to this event that broke my father down. In a family of highly educated and successful individuals, dropping out of high school was just unthinkable. And, always a homebody, the idea of traveling was always unpleasant. I developed flu-like symptoms and stayed home watching Due South reruns on VHS over and over until the tapes began to break down. Through my preteen to teen years, that remarkable lack of remarkableness continued. I got rebellious at 16 as I began to explore who I was and how I felt about the world around me. I got into punk rock music and shows, tried learning guitar, and began craving the attention that came with being a gregarious purple-haired teen. At the shows, and even in the liner notes of a local band's debut album, I was called Crazy Mike Howie, a title bestowed for antics within and outside of mosh pits that I held proudly and a little too firmly. That fit in well with my father's traditional conservative outlook, which predictably led to conflict, but even that was stereotypical and without significant incident. There was a lot going on for me at that time, and frankly, I'm a little hazy still on some of those details. But it was in that 16 to 18-year-old range that things started going off the rails. My average grades slipped into the arena of failing. My social life was erratic, wanting to go out and let loose with complete abandon, and simultaneously wanting to watch Star Trek and eat chicken wings by myself. I'd find it impossible to fall asleep, and then after 9 hours of slumber, find it impossible to wake up. There were times I really felt crazy. I was trying so hard to fit in and be this certain type of person, combating how I really felt much of the time, and teaching myself the horrible lesson that not caring and failing was easier than trying to succeed. And that lesson hit just about every aspect of my life. Around the time I was 17, the coping strategies I had inadvertently developed, such as rocking out hard at punk shows and caring too much about not caring, began breaking down. I distinctly remember one day sitting on the grass with 2 friends waiting for a bus to go get a tattoo, and suddenly feeling sick. It was hard to define sick at the time. I was hungry but nauseated. I was sweaty but cold. And I was really, really uncomfortable. I bailed and went home, where I quickly felt better. This kind of situation began repeating itself with growing regularity, including the night of my then-girlfriend's semi-formal. At the event, I began developing those same symptoms. I went to the bathroom and dry heaved. I had to use the toilet, but couldn't. I felt like I was being chased by something that wasn't there, which was equal parts terrifying from the physical manifestation and the realization that I felt like I was being chased by something that wasn't there. I went home and again felt better by the time I fell asleep. It was within a few weeks, though, that 3 things happened. My grandfather died, I was told my high school didn't expect to see me back in September, and my family was supposed to be going west to an out-of-town wedding. I never knew my grandfather well, something I do regret to this day, and I didn't know how to respond to this event that broke my father down. In a family of highly educated and successful individuals, dropping out of high school was just unthinkable. And, always a homebody, the idea of traveling was always unpleasant. I developed flu-like symptoms and stayed home watching Due South reruns on VHS over and over until the tapes began to break down. But as those flu-like symptoms abated, I tried going outside to see my friends or to sneak out for the cigarettes I would hide. As soon as I got past the driveway, though, I started feeling dizzy. That dizziness was always the first wave of an unspecified panic that would come on. And the only thing that would lead to the end of the sweating, raised heart rate, cramping stomach, and inability to control my thoughts was going back inside. This was my parents' house, and I had a relatively large bedroom in the basement with only a tiny little window up at the top of the room. It was something of a fortress to me. I had my computer, a TV, my guitar, and a phone line to my mom, everything I needed to avoid going outside ever again. In the ensuing weeks, I'd spend 24 to 30 hours awake, checking out IRCs and MUDs, which was nerd socialization before instant messaging. I was watching movies and TV, and barely eating. Then when I did eat, eating only unhealthy, high-fat foods when I could really stomach something. This would be followed by no less than 12 and around an average of 16 hours of sleep. My parents were rightly concerned, and with much love-filled nagging, prompted me to visit the doctor. For how my family doctor handled the next months, I'll always be grateful. I was ordered to get multiple types of blood tests done, and he gave me a few sleep aids to try and jumpstart a regular sleeping schedule to see if maybe that was the root cause of my still unspecified ailment. I was referred to a social worker and a psychiatrist concurrently for diagnoses. Then he and I sat with his great big DSM, his pharmacology tome, and the eventual reports from the social worker and psychiatrist. Both of those professionals came back with the same diagnosis: Generalized Anxiety Disorder, with touches of social anxiety, agoraphobia, and depression. In all, that process and my avoidance put the breakdown to a little over 3 months. Now, for months, I've been describing the unknown feelings and illness as that feeling you get when you first wake up from a nightmare and aren't quite sure what's real. Putting a label to it all should have been a major victory. Retrospectively, it was. But at the time, it really didn't help me feel any different. It was only after the reports from the psychologist and the social worker were concluded, and with some research, that my doctor prescribed me citalopram. I don't remember what the initial dosage was. I didn't want to take pills, what self-respecting damn the man teen does. But I was physically feeling worse on a near daily basis. I had put on 40 or 50 pounds that summer, and I wasn't seeing a future. It was with a what's the worst that can happen kind of attitude that I began taking the pills, and lo and behold, within a few weeks, was able to start getting the mail from down the street, going to the gas station to buy chips, and eventually take the bus to buy some new shoes. For the first several months following this, I went to see my doctor every other week, then once a month, and for the remainder of his practicing career in the following years, every 6 months to check in with my medication, moods, coping, and so on. There's a lot I did wrong that summer, and in those early days of managing my anxiety in a healthier manner, I found out who real friends were, and I admittedly cut out a lot of people. One friend, Jackie, didn't give up on me. She visited me in my parents' basement with regularity, and we watched movies, TV, and played cards without the judgment or pressure for me to be crazy Mike Howie at the punk show. My family did everything they could in their own ways. My sister was in university, working and traveling, but would join me for marathon movie watching. My mom would go above and beyond, keeping me alive with meals when I'd eat with the family, and picked up the newly released Everclear album, So Much for the Afterglow, for me. That album remains the soundtrack of the beginning of my recovery. My dad had always found ways to try and show his love and support too. I slowly built myself back up, a little less energetic, a fair bit less outgoing, and a whole lot more nervous than I was before. I tried going back to another school, but quickly became overwhelmed. I eventually wrote the high school equivalency exam instead. I even got into college, both a school in Ottawa for radio broadcasting and the local college for print journalism. Though the former offered a small bursary, moving was an impossibility to me at the time, so I went local. Through all of this, I wasn't healed. I wasn't going to therapy or involving myself in treatment beyond the pills, and I still wasn't making healthy decisions. I started smoking again. I continued to eat relatively poorly. The only exercise I got was walking from place to place, which I'd avoid whenever possible. In those early days and into my mid-20s, I had this Dickie saddlebag. It was blue and had clunky clips that always pinched my fingers. It was always with me. It'd have a bottle of water, my regular citalopram as well as a sedative, bus tickets, $10 in cash, 1 or 2 granola bars, playing cards, notebooks, whatever book I was reading at the time, my CD player, and batteries for my CD player. It was a survival kit. All of the things that could make me feel a little safer in case of an anxiety attack until I could get home. I wouldn't go out of the house without that bag, and simply not having it would lead to anxiety attacks. Life moved forward. Time doesn't stop while you sort yourself out, and I knew I needed a direction. I finished most of my college program. I dropped out for a job opportunity that didn't pan out, and then was able to pick up another full-time job before I would resume courses. I didn't have a whole lot of real friends now that crazy Mike Howie had retired. I dated a little bit and met a girl with whom I began a long-term relationship. To me, at that time, life was good, but the anxiety was always present, always just a single crack away from breaking open. At work, I excelled. I began winning awards for my news writing, which focused on crime. That expanded into awards for editorial or opinion pieces, news writing on politics, and eventually writing on the environment. By the time I was 30, I was acting managing editor of a newspaper in a sizable community and had 17 awards under my belt. At home, I didn't excel. The anxiety was always a problem. My coping mechanisms, largely based on avoidance and a structure of unhealthy habits like excessive smoking and withdrawal from emotions into my own head, were a stressor on my relationship. In my early and mid-20s, the desire to be someone I thought I should be, rather than who I naturally was, also created problems. It wasn't helpful that my then girlfriend turned wife turned ex-wife didn't really see anxiety as an illness, but an excuse. To be fair to her, I did use it as an excuse regularly, and occasionally catch myself doing so to this day. Playing Monday morning Dr. Phil, that relationship should have ended multiple times before it did, for multiple reasons. My anxiety not only contributed to its ultimate demise, but frankly played a role in keeping it going longer than it should have. The end of that relationship was hard on me for the obvious reasons. Thankfully, we had no children or property, other than my TV and DVD collection, which she took because she was kind of mean like that. So the technical aspects of a breakup and divorce were relatively straightforward. But it was also hard because it removed a bit of my identity. I wasn't too sure who I was other than journalist, guy with anxiety, and a part of that relationship. It did, however, give me the opportunity / kick in the butt, I guess, to start figuring out who I actually was. In no particular order, I discovered in that time period that I'm non-violent and compassionate by nature, pretty okay with not being the ideal body type, an unashamed fan of Star Trek, Star Wars, and Doctor Who, also pretty okay with not ever being rich or owning a big house alongside which I could park a fancy car, and that being upset by the death of an animal, be it a cat or dog, deer or cow, fish or bird, doesn't make me less of a man. Coming to terms with these aspects of who I am didn't make the anxiety go away, but it did make feeling bad about those aspects of my identity go away, and that itself was a pretty significant step. Now, as I started discovering all of these new parts about myself, I also started volunteering at the Humane Society, covering environmental and wildlife issues at the paper, and working with groups like my current employer, the Fur Bears. But the anxiety was still there, and it would rear its head whenever I wasn't looking. I moved back out of my parents' place and into Hamilton. I dated off and on, with nothing too serious. I met one super smart woman who was into dogs, but at the time didn't actually want to date me, and while we had fun, we never progressed into a romantic relationship. Now that's a story with a rather happy ending, so we'll circle around to it. It was after one breakup that I found myself spiraling. I went to see a therapist, something I had done a few times, and while it helped me manage some of the situational anxiety I'd come up against, it never really polished the anxiety itself off. The therapist gave me some good solutions. I had allowed my self-worth to become tied up in how someone saw me again, rather than who I really am. But most importantly, she helped me confront my biggest fear: falling back down into the dark metaphorical pit of my parents' basement. It's hard to explain how much that really terrified me. I had nightmares about it. Any catastrophic thoughts would eventually lead to the idea of having another breakdown. And my only real coping strategy up until that point was to push away the fear by replacing it with forced anger. She put it simply, and it's a good lesson that I remind myself of regularly: you aren't who you were then. I'm not sure if it's something other people with anxiety have ever really experienced, and I'd like to hear if you have. But sometimes, when those damn spiraling thoughts start up, a simple point of logic can smash it apart, and it's like a beam of sunlight breaking through dark clouds. For me, this is probably at the top of my 3 biggest times that happened. The other 2 had to do with writing about pandemic flu viruses and having that smashed open by a cashier sneezing in my face, and the other with end-of-the-world conspiracies from 2012, and a friend telling me, why should I care? I'll be dead too. The experiences I'd had in the more than 10 years since that unfortunate summer had given me an assortment of tools. Some good, some bad, and the realization that I got out of it once. Why couldn't I get out of it again? Suddenly, one of the very biggest fears I'd carried for a long time was simply gone. Now that mostly catches us up. I failed as a dog walker for the Humane Society and ended up adopting my favorite walkie, JJ, a stray dog who picked me. And if you listen to this podcast or Defender Radio, you'll regularly hear JJ circling around me as I talk. The super smart woman who was into dogs but at the time didn't want to actually date me? Well, we played Mario Kart a few times a year later. She pretended to like the Captain America movie to get on my good side. And now we're married. Kate's been my best friend for a few years now, and with her support and love, I've been able to push further against my anxiety than ever before. And despite the traveling, the change, the crowds, and the pressure of a pending event, I felt absolutely no worry on the day of our wedding. Just pure, absolute happiness. These days, the anxiety still exists. It's nowhere near where it has been, and I've even reduced my medication dosage significantly. But it still creeps up from time to time, and I'm always learning about new tools to cope and manage it. I'm also really excited to be starting a new group cognitive behavioral therapy program at one of the local healthcare networks in just a few weeks. A lot of what I've told you is said with the lens of retrospection. As a child, I was worried a lot and afraid of being afraid and the physical manifestation of it. I was afraid of failing, so I didn't even try. I felt truly mad at times and felt horribly alone at others. I've also met people for whom my worst days would feel like a walk in a sunny park. And through my work at the newspaper, I met the families of people who, for a variety of reasons, didn't make it. I said at the beginning of this introductory episode that I'm no expert, that this isn't a replacement for a doctor or medical professional, and that I can't advocate for any one type of treatment over another for any kind of ailment. What I want to do is selfish. Tell my story, hear the stories of others, and talk to people who may have a new perspective on this massive subject of mental health. This is the Everyday Fray podcast. This is my journey, and it's far from over.